Well, thanks for coming, y'all. So welcome to On and Off Ramps, designing and building systems to move billions of dollars. So quick primer on me. My name's Alan. Used to be a product manager at Coinbase. Led a bunch of our payment integrations, shifted gears to go help out our custody team. And so moving fiat, crypto, moving money around has been kind of a personal joy of mine for the last couple of years. Recently started a company called Eisen. By show of hands, who knows what a sheetment is in the audience? I got some eager hands up there. Let's go. So a sheetment's the concept of what happens with 3 to 5 year dormant accounts. When you have old accounts where you can't find the person, you have to turn them over to the state government. So it's kind of the ultimate off-ramp, which we'll come back to at the end. I like to start and end my talks with different quotes that I think frame the topic. And so one of the big kind of recent books that I've come to love is this book called 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals by a guy named Oliver. And when we're talking about on and off ramps and architectures and all these things, there's so much whiteboard and design and iteration and thinking that we can do, where you're not gonna get it perfect. No one here has time to get it perfect. Our goal is to just do slightly better with some intentional thought and then dive in and make progress. We have the mental capacities to do it for infinitely ambitious plans and practically no time at all to do them. So going to cover kind of four tranches of things here. So we're going to start with what are on and off ramps. This is a term that we hear used differently in different contexts. It affects payments, it affects accounts, it affects compliance, and it sits at the intersection of a lot of these kind of core concepts that a lot of different speakers are talking about throughout the conference. We're going to switch gears into tech dependencies. This is one of my personal favorite XKCDs, but we'll talk a little bit more about what goes on kind of the technical side of this. We'll talk through some of the human dependencies. Nothing in payments happens without people, as much as we would like to believe that it's all tech. And then we'll talk about a couple of stories that we've picked up along the way, some lessons, some learnings, and some serious pain. So on and off ramps. I kind of love this metaphor of highways that people use for a lot of payments things. There's simultaneously, if you think about kind of people moving money onto and off of your platform, everything's happening at the same time through the same partners, affecting the same systems at different times of day, night, volume, etc. And so at its core, on and off ramps are integrations with different payment networks. There's 2 main types of payments that will kind of bucket things into broadly. There's push payments. So this is where I go into my portal, I type in your information, and I send you money. So it shows up as a credit to you. This is Venmo, this is wires, this is international payments, this is faster payments, the new FedNow that everybody's talking about, real-time payments. All these things are push payments. The reason that the thing to take away from this is that it really just shows up to the person receiving the money with absolutely no warning. Your system just detects that there's now money there with some metadata, and you kind of got to sort it out. So we'll come back to that in a second. The other is pull payments. So this is things like ACH. This is credit cards. This is, in the Netherlands and Germany, Sofort and Ideal. There's multiple different types of like payment flows that people need to kind of understand at a core level to figure out how to design systems around them. Push payments, I have no idea they're coming. They just show up. Pull payments, I initiate them as the recipient of the payment. So I initiate it, I know it goes into a started state, stuff happens, and then it settles after the fact. Push payments are infinitely harder from a on-off ramp perspective because they just show up into your account, and you kind of have to figure out a bunch of different things about that payment to figure out whether or not you can actually accept it. But backing up just a second, how do I, as whether I'm a fintech, I'm an app, I'm a bank, whatever, how do I actually offer on and off ramps? Each of those payment networks is, you've probably heard compliance thrown about 50 different times through different sessions, but you need access to, you need a partnership with a participant in the payment network to participate. So we'll use Coinbase as an example. When Coinbase offers like FedWire support for you to be able to wire money to or wire money off of Coinbase, Coinbase doesn't have access to the FedWire system. Coinbase has a partnership with a bank who gives Coinbase the ability to use their access to the FedWire system. So everything that you're doing is permissioned and based off of what happens with a partner under the hood, which is where different flows, different compliance limitations, and all the different kind of components of that really come into play. And so you as the company don't necessarily get direct access to the network. You have to go get a partner that was willing to give you that, and all of the kind of things that follow on are as a result of that partnership. Within those types of partnerships, so we'll talk about kind of the generic 50,000-foot view of what are some of the things that your partners are going to ask you to do. This is especially relevant when we're talking about things like a push payment, which money just shows up into your account. You have basically no ability to prevent that money from showing up. You have to figure it out after the fact, but you still need to go through all the same level of compliance review and everything else that your partner's going to make you do. So the three major buckets are transaction review. So let's take a look at that metadata. Do we know who this belongs to? Can we attribute it to the right account in our system from some random data that we're getting from some typically bank file that gets uploaded in batch? Do the payment details on this match what we're expecting? This is, if you've ever heard about name matching, this is where that comes from. I need to make sure that this is a first-party payment between the same person from some external source to my internal version of that person's account. So in a Coinbase wire example, I receive a wire from Coinbase into their big account, receives a wire from Bank of America from Alan. Now, Alan Smith, Alan Osgood, those aren't the same people. We need to look at the details on that payment to understand, is this the same person? And with the same information that we would expect this payment to have based on matching that up. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that kind of comes into that we'll talk about in a minute. Is there incriminating info on this payment that we need to worry about? So if this payment has a sender with an address in North Korea, this isn't a payment we can accept, regardless of if we know who this account is. And so looking at on every single one of these transactions, we have to be screening them for a bunch of the BSA compliance, which we won't dive too deep into, but all of the things that our partner bank is making sure that we're enforcing so that they don't get in trouble. After we've kind of matched that, we've looked at the transaction, we've attributed it to the person on the platform, we've done some basic review of that information, then we need to take a look at that person's account. Is Alan Osgood's account on Coinbase, have I passed KYC? Have I passed my Know Your Customer stuff? Have I passed all my OFAC screening? And I'm not on any terrorist or sanctions lists. Have I been marked as fraudulent? All the things kind of within the platform that make sure that I'm in good standing, we have to check every single time these payments come in, because we wouldn't want to give a fraudster more money from some other platform that's coming in. We'd want to block that and send it back, especially if that account's been compromised. And then the third, some activity review. Is there anything that tells me that this person's sketchy? That I need to file what's called a suspicious activity report, that this account's been being used for money laundering, and we're doing this on a regular basis. Now, that kind of leads into how do you design the systems with some of that context. And so this is kind of a well-known dependency XKCD, but the idea is that in a world where it's not intentionally designed, you kind of end up with one major choking point within any system that if it gets pulled out, the whole thing collapses. That's especially true with payments. So I'll talk through this really quickly, but this is how we ended up architecting the push payments on-ramp flow. So Coinbase as a business is designed to support payment methods and customers from all over the world. And different geographies have different payment methods, have different payment networks, and we want to support as many of them as we can in as tech flexible and product flexible of a way as possible. And so the architecture that we settled in on was having what we called satellite constellations. So Fedwire had kind of a constellation of satellites where we'd have multiple different Fedwire partners that we talked about a little bit earlier. So we'd have 2 or 3 different Fedwire partners who'd all have their own satellites, which was where that would interface with that partner. So imagine a quick flow with me for a second, where you have a Fedwire partner. We have one of our Cross River friends in the room. So a Cross River has their understanding of the world as a partner. We'd have a satellite microservice on our side that's communicating back and forth with our bank partner. Then we would have our internal core system, which in this is the push payments queue, that would receive messages back and forth from that specific standardized microservice. That then feeds into all the set of compliance checks and other things that we just kind of briefly talked about. So we have individual microservices doing the communication back and forth with each of our bank partners. Then we have a standardized messaging interface between our version of that satellite and our core push payment queue. And then when that wire shows up to Cross River, shows up into the satellite, gets pushed into our kind of internal push payments queue, that's when we start running all of those compliance checks that each of our different partners asked us to do. So the complexity here really happens really quickly when you have multiple different partners for the same payment methods with different types of compliance screenings that they require. And so there's a couple of standard ones. So does this payment have sanctioned information on it that we can't do business with? Is it from Iran, Syria, wherever it might be? Those are standardized checks that we modularized into different components. So when we'd receive this payment, we'd call it an incoming push payment. It wasn't actually crediting any customer's account at that point. The first thing we would do is match it. Do we have a customer with a record that we can find that we can match this to? That was check number one. Check number two is, all right, is there anything on this payment that would cause us to return it? And then we'd run the series of checks for each of those payments with the kind of combination of what payment network is it, who's the payment partner, and then what's the account look like. And all of that, it's a ton of context that you have to take a look at for both that account and that payment before you can actually credit it to the customer. And so this was how we kind of architected the flow of being able to standardize and modularize as much of that as we possibly could. There's still our compliance library ended up having a bunch of different checks in it, but it allowed us to kind of write code once that we would then reuse for both different bank partner integrations and different satellites and across payment networks as we'd be, we've talked about Fedwire quite a bit. Swift is an international international form of wire that we also supported, but you can imagine all of the other types of push payments here being different constellations of these satellites that would all feed into this standardized push payment queue. Why does this help? The reason we wanted to kind of create this kind of standardized flow is not only that you can save a bunch of code by doing modularized compliance checks, but then you can create streamlined processes with your teams who need to do any intervention around them. So if we can standardize what the set of issues are for incoming payments, we can then design support queues, we can design other processes around handling any of the kind of issues that we would have. And then we design kind of whatever state machine transitions those people would need to actually be able to advance those payments through whatever issue they had. So in this example, say we have Alan sends a wire through crossover, comes into the satellite, gets into the push payments queue. Alan's a good account. This payment doesn't have anything that we consider to be sketchy on it. We're able to match everything. Great. Credit that payment immediately, and you've automatically processed your incoming wire. And so this is how we get people's money in the happy path credited to their accounts extremely quickly. And at the end of the goal, that's the business objective here. How do we have good payments for good customers credit extremely quickly, and then filter out all of the set of things that would cause problems there? So in a world where my Coinbase account had been frozen for, I don't know, I forgot to update KYC or something, I'd have that payment come in, it would hit the satellite, it would get put into the push payments queue, it would get matched to my account, and then it would get flagged for missing KYC info or something like that. And instead of crediting to the customer, which is what would happen in the happy path, it would get pushed into the manual review queue with a missing KYC information flag on it that somebody would be able to actually work in a very streamlined way with our customer support or banking ops team to be able to resolve the issues for that specific payment. And those flows and filterings took us quite a while to kind of design that whole setup. But it allowed us to build this in a way that was flexible and extensible to a bunch of different issues that we saw across a bunch of these different push payment networks. And with the added bonus that when we wanted to add redundancy, when we wanted to add new partners, we'd be able to do so really, really quickly. So this is kind of how we did, I'll leave it with push payments for now on tech design, but happy to take questions here. This is where we spent quarters getting this right. And this is what really allowed us to scale the number of push payment methods that we supported as we expanded around the world. This was right around 2018, 2019 that we really got this going and started moving billions of dollars through the system, automatically crediting customers and keeping all of our bank partners happy with the compliance checks that we were running. Tech dependencies are half the puzzle. One of the things I learned as a product manager doing this is that these bank integrations take a village to get going. And so the number of meetings I sat in like this, both in Teaneck, New Jersey and other places, was pretty funny. But these things have payments touch a lot of different teams. There's a lot of different parties involved. And so one of the things that we always were very conscious of was, what do each of those different people want? What do they fear? And how do we navigate that as we're doing one of these integrations? So from kind of the beginning, imagine product wants to expand in Japan. Awesome. There's a first thing that you're going to do is you're going to need an exec sponsor to be able to champion that we're doing that geographic expansion. Then you need business development and some of your kind of deal team to go find a bank partner, to court that bank partner, to get them to even talk to you. You're going to need to bring in your legal and compliance teams to get them to discuss the controls that you would need, to discuss the economics of the deal, to discuss all these things. And we're 2 or 3 levels away from tech here. This is what are the controls that we're going to ask of you? Is that feasible? How do we negotiate those? Does that fit our systems? Then you start getting into kind of what's the product experience look like? Would this bank partner and the payment methods that they want to offer actually power the product experiences that we want for that specific set of customers? Then you get into designing what the flow is. How do we make this a great user experience? Then you get into how do we build this and architect this, and then you play this all the way through. How do we do the reconciliation for each of these payments and design that flow out? To how do we make sure that we keep our customers happy? This can go awry at any one of these levels, and so one of the things that we did was always kind of go through, and we used typically some version of like product requirements docs and kickoff meetings and regular syncs to keep everyone in the loop on this stuff. But how do I kind of build this end-to-end process that we can do in a repeatable way that allows us to launch payment methods really quickly. Keeping all of these stakeholders happy was quite a lift for us, but as we got into the groove with it, and we're able to standardize both on the tech side, so that kind of diagram that I showed earlier, and on the process and human side, it allowed us to go a lot faster. And so creating shared expectations and a deep understanding of what each of your stakeholders wanted here was a big unlock for us. And then we kind of knew some of the concerns people would have. We're able to proactively address those things and design kind of a standard on-off ramp launch process to be able to go through and accelerate the number of payment methods that we could offer to our customers. So lastly, I'll jump to story time with a couple of good, a couple of bad, and then we can dive into some questions. But 4 of the kind of major payment integrations I had a chance to work on here, sadly 2 of them no longer exist. So we'll save our tears on that one. But we did a Silvergate Bank integration that moved billions of dollars for institutional clients. We did a Signature Bank integration, which did the same thing. Both of those, through either bankruptcy or receivership or acquisition, no longer exist. But this is where kind of all of these things come together, where you can have the most beautifully architected tech system, you can run the best process, but if the bank doesn't exist, payments, you're not the one with the network access. So if your partner has issues, you have issues, and so who you pick as your partner matters a lot. These were both great partners for us, and deeply appreciative of all the work we did together, but sad to see that those payment integrations obviously got turned off, as did the banks. Barclays was a really interesting one. We launched faster payments in the UK. This was actually one of my first big projects there. This was our first big on-off ramp. But coming into, okay, great, you're having a conversation with the Barclays bankers, you're running them through the compliance processes, and you're talking through kind of a system architecture. Like how you structure that all the way through. The relationship ended up coming to a close late in 2019 for a variety of reasons. But all of the kind of work that we did, all the volume we moved, and then off-ramping those things, really taught us the lesson of how do you design flexible systems to add and remove bank partners through your architecture in a way that doesn't require you to custom rebuild the entire flow every single time. And then lastly, PayPal. PayPal started as actually an off-ramp instead of just being a pure on-ramp. And so the PayPal integration that we did was PayPal's kind of first venture into crypto. But for all of these, you had an extra layer of risk mitigation you needed to convince them, which was, hey, this is a crypto company and you're off-ramping from crypto into the US payment system. That's a very traditionally like high-risk flow. How do we make sure that you're doing all of the kind of account reviews and monitoring and on-chain analysis that we need to be able to handle here? And so really fun one there, but that one's still moving millions of dollars, which is exciting to see. So these things done at scale, done correctly, allow you to move massive amounts of volume, to move really quickly within organizations, and to be able to be flexible to evolving partner needs, whether that's partners changing their risk appetite, you changing your needs, partners going out of business. These things on and off ramps exist in a very dynamic environment. So we'd love to say that they're set and forget, but that would be missing kind of the evolving business context in which these relationships exist. So that's the end of kind of prepared stuff. I have many more stories that we can cover there. But the kind of closing quote here, that especially as we're thinking about all of the different kind of evolving components, we're made so uneasy by the experience of allowing reality to unfold at its own speed that when we're faced with a problem, it feels better to race towards a resolution, any resolution, than to let reality unfold at its own pace. So this is the example that I had here was how do we design the perfect Silvergate integration, get that going exactly, rush that as much as you can, and at the end of the day, that wasn't necessarily the limiting factor, but allowing the state of the field, the reality of the situation to unfold, and focusing instead on how do we design, not necessarily rushing this individual thing, but design the system in a way that it's flexible to the evolving needs of each of these individual components. Lastly, thank you. So I mentioned a lot of these stories are kind of coming from some of my Coinbase learnings. What we're focused on now is helping companies manage their achievement compliance, which is kind of the ultimate off-ramp. This is what happens when both when you have customers who've been, whether dormant or passed away or whatever happened, no longer active, and you need to move those assets over to the government. We help automate the state-by-state compliance requirements and processing that you have to do. So I'm happy to talk payment on-off ramps, happy to talk achievement stuff, happy to talk compliance stuff. Open floor for questions. Yeah. So PayPal's not a bank, it's a state money transmitter. So they have their own closed loop network, which is what allows them to not necessarily need the bank partnership. But I believe, if I remember correctly, they do have bank partnerships to do some of their card stuff, to do a bunch of other things. But PayPal themselves was able to hold customer funds using their money transmission licenses they had in every one of the states. They would not. So FedWire is a system of the Federal Reserve, so you have to have a bank charter to get access to that. But PayPal has access to their own closed loop network in the same way that Cash App has debit credit cards sponsored by a bank, because they're not a bank, but they have their own closed loop system where if you want to send money back and forth to another Cash App person, that you can do on their ledger. Sure. So when we did FedWire, we were actually one of the first partners on one of the first FedWire APIs. So a couple of banks now have emerged with having API support for the FedWire system. The mass majority use some combination of batch file processing and SFTP uploads. So we got very familiar between FedWire and ACH with reading a batch, ingesting a CSV, data dumping it into our model, ingesting that through our flow, taking all of our transactions, batch uploading them back, and sending it over. And so I think the method of communication here is one of the reasons we really liked that satellite architecture, is because how our microservice communicated with their integration changed by the partner. And so having a centralized way to do that to all those different partners was too cumbersome because they weren't uniform enough, versus splitting it out into a microarchitecture service allowed us to standardize our communication layer. So all FedWires that came into Coinbase from our satellites looked the same. All FedWires from the satellite to the bank partner ended up looking different based on what fields they needed, what core they had, what methodology of uploading communication they used, varied quite a bit. So this is one where if you can read the spec, read the spec. We had a couple of situations where someone had a fully custom way of doing something. And so as much of the documentation and spec as we could read, we would. But this isn't like a ISO 2022 kind of situation. This was you have a wire that shows up for you somehow. We need to interpret that somehow. We need to credit that somehow. And all of that messaging layer just needs to work. All right, next question. Great questions, though. Stand here and sip my water while people are thinking of great questions. Hmm?
Yeah, related to kind of the incoming wires, right?
Sure.
Are there a lot of assumptions you can make on the compliance requirements? Probably no web wires coming in from Iran, and you still have to go through those kind of checks, even though the lightning has passed.
The engineer in me is like, why in the world compliance would we get? Like, it's a domestic payment rail. Why in the world would I get one from Iran? That doesn't make sense. The person who sat in the bank rooms, as soon as the chance is above zero, I need a story. I need a story as to why you're not going to have this happen. For Swift, we had absolutely no reason that it couldn't happen. And so you go implement Thomson Reuters World Check, your Revantive World Check, and you have some screening through OFAC lists. But it's all risk-based. So we come back to like what each of those different parties is thinking about. A compliance person's worst nightmare is they sign off on something for you as an engineer or a product person, and then a regulator shows up and it tanks the partnership because the partner gets in trouble because you're doing something wrong. This is headline risk. So like Coinbase credits Iranian wire. Everybody through that entire chain is getting some combination of scolded or fired. And so the thinking through what's the story that we had to defend this was kind of part of the product role. But that marriage of how does compliance and product and engineering all work together was part of the art of that negotiation. But this is why we knew we were going to get different partners with kind of pseudo-random different requests and different levels of risk tolerance. So it wasn't perfectly deterministic. It was like very much based on what each person wanted. And so that's where the kind of library setup of like, write the name matching check once, use that for each of these different things that need it. It allows you to plug and play. And then if you have a miss on it, you have a standardized process to be able to escalate that to someone who needs to take a look. You guys got some great questions. Any other good ones? Sure.
Where do a lot of the first transaction checks actually performed by the bank? Part of the bank, I assume money from your credit is coming from someone at OFAC list where they get that check from.
So
Double check.
I think it's probably like a third or a fourth check at that point. But like the way the risk shifts, like everybody has to check every time. It's like you can't just like passport an identity across every different vendor that might be reapproving that person. So take the example of a Swift wire that gets sent, moving money from like Japan to the US, the partner bank. That's probably touching 4 or 5 banks across that journey. And every single one of them is screening for basically the same things. So everybody has to be looking. The odds to your question that you're going to find a hit that no one else has found is low, unless it's information that only you have, which is like, is this a first-party payment? Can I name match? Can I do any of those things that kind of evidence that? But the way the compliance requirements always come in is, hey, we can only support first-party payments. The product and eng then task is, okay, we're going to look at the name and make sure that those match. Is that sufficient for you to prove that this is a first-party payment? Yes, no, is kind of how those checks come to be in the first place. But that's a dance, that's an art. That's not something that's like perfectly linear. Any other bank partner or payment integration questions? Awesome, y'all. Well, thank you so much. I'll be hanging out around for a couple of minutes. Appreciate you all coming.